Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Mark from Solo Games, and today we're back. It's been a really long, busy 1 to 2 weeks, so a little bit slower on the content, but honestly, it's just been a lot of work around the house, a lot of work, personal life things like that, and work, my other job, not this like me talking to people on camera. It's like, hey, what's going on, Solo Games? Whoa, it's Mark. Anyways, a patron asked me a question last week, and I thought it was really interesting about Sorcery TCG. I figured, I really dove into Grand Archive, and for the past like about 3 months now, I've really enjoyed Grand Archive, right? And I've been a big advocate for the game. And my channel has been always about like Magic the Gathering and a lot of Magic related things. And so I took a big dive into Grand Archive. I figured, if patrons asking me about Sorcery and I see a lot of really hype things about Sorcery, everyone's talking about it, how it's the fixed magic, all this stuff, I figured at least I should know what's going on, which, meaning I need to put some time and effort into researching it. In fact, I feel like the question that the patron posed to me was interesting in that it's asking pretty deep questions about the game itself, about long-term collectability, investment ability, but also gameplay. And I feel like I can't really answer any of those questions until I do my own research. And honestly, if I don't do the research, what's the point of talking to you on the camera about it? So I did the research. I spent probably like a good 5 to 10 hours of research on Sorcery. I don't have any of the cards yet, but I did watch a ton of videos about the content, about how to learn how to play, watch some box openings of the Sorcery TCG, watched a Let's Play between the two creators, or two devs of Sorcery TCG. I feel like right now I have a pretty good grasp of how the game plays, how kind of like the deck building aspects work, rarity, etc., all those things. So I think what I'm going to do for this video is more of almost like an overview or my perspective on the Sorcery TCG as part of this video. Off the bat, I'm just going to be honest, guys. Like, what I'm saying is just my opinion. Some of you guys won't like what I'm saying, and if you like Sorcery or whatever, that's great. But there's going to be elements of this video, I think, that I'm providing a very fair commentary, but I think obviously some people are just going to take it as me being negative or whatever. I'm just being real. It's just who I am. So let's get started. First, let's talk about the rarity. So this is all about the pack opening, the box opening system, right? So Sorcery is a game where you buy a box of the booster packs, and you essentially have like around 9 foils, 8 uniques, and then I didn't really count the elites and the other ones, but basically the rarity works like this. Ordinary is like common, exceptional is like uncommon, elite is a rare, and then unique is a mythic rare, whatever you want to call it, some rarity above a rare, right? Each pack you're expected to get at least one elite. Sometimes that elite is a unique. There is also like secret rarities above unique as well. I'm not really going to touch that stuff because it's kind of like really uber secret rare. So I'm not really sure exactly what the drop rates are. It's a little bit mysterious, and I think the game creators made it that way to add in this extra element of mystery, right? But in general, right, like I think the fact that there is a secret rarity in general is a positive thing. I think it's the fact that like there's some sort of like discovery element, there's like some surprise or beyond a pack rarity or beyond even a booster box rarity type of things I like. I mean, Grand Archive has, collector super rares, collector ultra rares. I'm totally down with those kind of things, right? I'm not against that. I think it's fine. I think one of my issues is if these secret rares are actually cards, and if they're cards that are viable for the game, which then you're starting to do things where you lock certain players out of the game, right? This is one of the things I don't like about Fab, is that there are like fabled, right, or legendary cards which are really, really rare, but they could also be fairly good for the play. So essentially, if you're a player and you need that one item, equipment, whatever, but it's a legendary or fable, you may be spending $1, $2, $3, $4, $500 for a card just to play it. That's the cheapest version, by the way. It's not even going for the super fancy version. And that I have a problem with in general, which I think Grand Archive does pretty well because their super rares are of very common cards, meaning everyone has access to it. Obviously, if you're a collector, you can have a super rare version of a very common card. Imagine, for example, the rarest cards in Magic are going to be your basic lands, something like that. right? The other problem I have with generally the rarity of the way that rarity is represented within sorcery is they're using wording, right? Ordinary, exceptional, elite, unique, etc. I think it's very cool, like flavor wise is awesome. But one of the problems is like this yields a lot of time or space for scamming. I mean, there's going to be a lot of players who don't really understand this part of it, and they may not look at all the cards and realize this is actually a rare, this is a mythic rare or whatever, and they may not understand that part. And somebody could take that as a hey, by the way, that's a like they can scam other people. It just leaves a lot of room for it because it's a little bit less obvious what is what rarity is the card. Whereas Magic, I think, and Pokemon really too, does this super well. Personally, I don't like how Fab and Grand Archive does this, where it's like a small letter on the bottom of the card that either are color coded or somehow shows the rarity. It's a little too small, a little bit too out of the way. I like the fact that it is color coded, so it's a little bit easier to go find them, but still, it's a little bit too like off the card. Magic, I think, does it really well. It's both color coded. It's also like it's a black color to a silver to a gold for rare to a mythic rare has that like orange gold kind of feeling. That's really good. It's obvious and it's right on the side of the card. You really can't miss it. Pokemon has a star or circle. Let's see. You have a circle for common, a diamond for uncommon, a star for rare. And I don't know if there's other rarities above that kind of stuff, but again, that's how Pokemon does it. And Pokemon makes sure that the really rare cards, right, at least in the old school days when I used to collect Pokemon, were the holo foil. So if you had a holographic foil, that was a super rare card. You didn't have like holographic foils of like super common cards. I know that stuff like changed later with reverse foils, all that. Kind of just ignoring that right now. But at least Pokemon was very clear about which cards are good, right? If you got a holo foil, you know you had a good card. It wasn't like a common card. So I think making it even less obvious than Grand Archive or Fab, where the name of the card implies rarity, is a little bit tricky. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. But in general, I think the mystery of like finding something, like looking at the card, and I think that the flavor idea is really cool. I just think that execution could be a little bit better. Card quality. Unfortunately, because I don't have any of the cards, I think it's a little bit tricky for me to go judge card quality. But from pictures, from looking at the cards themselves, I think they look pretty good, right? Without looking at the paper and seeing how thick it is, seeing if it's like up to standard, it's really tough. And a lot of times, eye appeal is rough without holding the card yourself. Like I can't judge it from looking through pictures, looking through the monitor at other people opening back boxes. It just can't quite do it. I do like the artwork though, so I hope they don't squander it by printing it low quality or printing on low quality paper. So there's that. Also by the way, if you didn't notice, Sorcery, at least the first print run, has alpha corners. Very similar to alpha Magic cards, has that rounded corner. I like that. I think it's very cool. It's a nice little callback and very subtle for, OG Magic players. They'll recognize it, but most other people don't understand what alpha corner is. I do like that callback. It's very fun. The artwork, right? Artwork is another plus for Sorcery. That artwork is really cool. It's gritty. It's like hand-drawn. Every one of those artwork feels really 90s style. So if you're one of those people who played like StarCraft or Diablo 1 or 2, right? And if you ever remember buying those like StarCraft, for example, or Diablo, they used to give you a little handbook that kind of starts you off. But inside the handbook, there were a lot of artwork, like done by different artists. Like I think Metzen was one of the guys, correct me if I'm wrong, at Blizzard, right? Who was doing the artwork also for StarCraft. And he did a lot of like sketch drawing and stuff like that. It has that really like Sharpie only type of feeling to it. Very like, gritty, dark kind of feel to it, right? It's really nice. I do like that kind of artwork. It reminds me heavily of the 90s. But of course, it's not for everyone, right? Just like Grand Archive, the anime style is not for everyone. I totally get it. It is what it is. But I do like the fact that it is hand-drawn. I do like the fact that it's just really beautiful looking, right? It's a nice piece of work, like very similar to things like this. It makes you feel like it's a little bit more just, I don't know how to describe it. It's a little bit more real, more visceral kind of feeling, right? And less like nowadays with most of the artwork digital generated, you lose a lot of that like feeling to the artwork. Not judging that, I think there's some great digitally generated artwork. I just don't think it's quite the same, right? And in particular, I'm thinking about cards like, the Harmonize in, I think it was the Strixhaven what's it called? Like the archives, right? Strixhaven archives, Harmonize, those kind of cards. It's not quite the same. And again, maybe I'm just the old guy. Like 90s artwork is kind of cool to me. Foils. At first, a lot of people were telling me like foils are super expensive for sorcery. It's super rare or something. But I was watching like a Rudy box opening. I was watching some other people's box openings, and I felt like it was really easy to get a foil, right? I mean, in fact, if I may be incorrect, but I saw like around 7 to 9 foils per box pretty consistently, which is, in my opinion, pretty high because that's in general what you're about getting with Magic cards nowadays. About 7 to 9, maybe 10 per box of 36 packs, right? Maybe that's actually kind of high. I think Magic you get 7 per box of 36 packs. So to me, that makes it so that foils should not hold a certain price or that premium quality over long periods of time. Now, of course, the alpha boxes being what they are the first print runs. Nobody else has access to it. I can see the cards being expensive and just being very limited. But my opinion on the foils, if you're a collector, I would wait and see how the market settles on them before you start jumping in because they do feel like they're less rare. I'll give you an example. If you look at Grand Archive, a box of Grand Archive, you get 3 foils. 3 in a box of 24 packs, right? Instead of 7 or 9 in a box of 36. So really think about like the actual rarity there and just say maybe it's not actually as rare as you think it is. So I think the foils are a little bit inflated, and even on the Grand Archive side, right? Like the foils are inflated. People talk about how the foil premium is a little bit inflated on Grand Archive. I'm not really quite sure. I do think Grand Archive does a really good job of foiling their cards, so there is some benefit to that, right? And talking about the special treatment of the foil. So Sorcery TCG does a embossed bordering for the foils, meaning like on the foil cards, the borders of the foils are like raised. So there's texturization for the borders, for the text, that kind of stuff. The back of the card is also the full art image of the front-facing foil, which is a really nice way to kind of do the representation. Obviously, the assumption is you're going to play this in a sleeve. So, if you put it in a deck, you can actually cheat because obviously it's going to tell you what the card is. But if you put it in the sleeve, I think it's totally fine. I do think it's actually a nice little touch to have like kind of like the full art artwork on the back. So that is nice, but maybe not necessary for the actual pieces here. Now, while this is special and different, I think it is actually quite lacking. So let's compare some things, right? In Magic, for example, there's like different types of foiling, and it does just the simple like foil over the whole card. So it has like a little bit of a 3D look, but it really isn't doing much more than that. Grand Archive does it a little bit better, where it kind of like actually highlights pieces of the card. It doesn't foil the whole thing. It highlights different pieces of the card. It's not just a simple like plastic foil layer above the card. So I think it's much better. See, the problem with Sorcery TCG is that it is just a foil over the whole card. It may look very dashing because as you kind of turn the card, you can see it's shining, but it really doesn't highlight any part of the card. It feels a little bit more ordinary to me, right? Whereas I think the people who do it the best actually is probably going to be like Fab, Flesh and Blood with the cold foils is really stunning, right? Cold foils, super. I mean, if you have never held a cold foil in your hand, go grab one. They're not too expensive, especially for the common equipment. But it highlights the border, obviously, but it also highlights parts of the card. So really like shines and it shows through what your equipment you're holding. Grand Archive actually does this really well too, but only in the collector super rares, right? CSRs or CURs, where it's not just a foil over, it's actually like texturized for the whole card. So the card itself is texturized, it has a gold signature on it. I mean, given that it has like that Japanese aesthetic of a card game, it knows how to do that part really well because it's just basically learning it from other games of its, same ilk. So that makes sense. All in all, I'm just saying I'm not super excited about Sorcery TCG's foil. I think it's fairly ordinary, and I do feel like it is fairly common. So I would not pay a ton of money for Sorcery foils right now. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but secret rarity, right? In general, I don't like it. I don't like the fact that there's secret rares that's not shown. I also don't like the fact that those secret rares could be actual cards, meaning it's just a card that people can use in a deck rather than a secret rare, which is a alter version of a very common card, right? That is a problem. I do think cards needs to be available for players. I don't think cards should be locked behind a secret rarity, behind a paywall, essentially. So that's my gripe against it. If you want to be a good card game, if you want to grow the player base, you really cannot have secret rares that are hyper rare, and essentially it's like players all need it. Let's say especially if it becomes a meta card, that's really a problematic thing, right? And imagine, like, for example, if basic lands were secret rares, like if you and if you get a swamp, you're like, I gotta play the swamp, but it's like a super secret rare, right? It's a little bit tricky there. So now we're kind of done with the collectability, the little, like, the outside the box type of discussions. Let's move on to gameplay. For this part, I watched Wizards Den's video on how to play sorcery, and then I also watched a let's play or whatever first play between the creators. I think it was Chase and Ira playing fire versus earth element, gameplay. So overall, right? The game on the surface, I'm gonna be honest, I think the gameplay is a minus for me, definitely. On the surface, it just looks too complicated. I know this part I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate, but I'm just trying to be real with you. I think on the surface, it's too complicated. You start out the game with a 20 grid, right? So 4x5, so 20 space grid. And the grid is where you kind of put your cards down, etc., right? You start your avatar on the center grid, and then you kind of can move out your territory as you lay down sites to then, expand your land and etc., right? I think really one of the things about card games that makes it like really rough is you have to think as a designer, things like tracking, right? Things that don't work really well in, for example, physical card games that work okay in digital is tracking of like damage points across all things. Now, sorcery doesn't make this mistake, and it definitely doesn't track damage across turns. So at the end of turns, any damage that did not kill a creature, it does just fall off, which is nice. So you don't have to track that across, right? The other thing about mana system, etc., is that those mana values, or meaning whatever mana you spent, you get them back at the beginning of the turn, which is also good. But the rule book, like for example, looks pretty epic. It's like a pretty long, hefty rule book. And I'm gonna be honest, yes, most games have really ridiculous amount of rules, and maybe Sorcery is just putting that rule book, up front and saying, hey, like here's the full rule book. Obviously, you don't need to read the whole thing. You can, of course, just do, like whatever the quick start guide to get going. This is the full rule. If you want to be a judge, you got to know, the different intricate details. But I do think that having a rule book like that is fairly intimidating, especially if it's the alpha or the first set. It really shouldn't be that complicated, in my opinion. So there's that. So let's talk specifics, right? Resource system. I think overall the resource system is better. It's better than Magic, obviously, being that you can just draw directly from a site's deck rather than drawing from the main deck, meaning at any point if you need more mana, you can just have it because you can take the draw from the side deck rather than the main deck, right? So you don't have to chance anything. Plus, in the beginning of the game, you draw 3 sites and you draw, I forget if it's 3 sites and 4 spells or 3 and 3, something like that. And of course, you have mulligans as well, so you can take the sites that you don't want, put it on the bottom, and then draw more to fill your hand with whatever you want to start with, right? But the resource system in general is a little bit confusing. And the reason is that because all sites generate a single mana, right? So there's 2 pieces to casting a sorcery card. There's the mana value, right? And then there's a threshold. So all sites generate mana, but then you also have to meet thresholds. For example, a card that's like, I don't know, like say 3 and 2 fire means that you have to meet a threshold where you have to have 2 of your sites that are fire sites. But it's a threshold. The thresholds aren't spent like in Magic. So the best way I can explain it is like this. If you have, let's say, a card that has 3 mana, right, and 2 threshold fire, if you have 3 lands or 3 sites on the board and at least 2 of them, could be more, are fire lands, fire sites, then you can cast a spell. But when you cast a spell, you actually have to spend the 3 mana. So you have 3 sites, they are spent. You can't cast a second spell that's, for example, 3 sites or 3 mana with 2 thresholds. While you do meet the threshold requirement of the second card, because those aren't spent, you don't meet the mana cost because you still have to spend your sites. The issue, of course, like when we talk about this on surface, it looks fine. The problem is mechanically it doesn't quite work because you can't really tap the sites on the grid. At least it's very difficult to do that. So you have to probably track your sites with a separate dice on the side, because the casting of cards can happen at any point in your turn. So essentially, in the beginning of the turn, at the end of the turn, you can always cast spells. So it's pretty rough to track, especially if the game state develops into a little bit later game. You may cast a spell, do some attacks and moves, and then cast more spells. How do you know you haven't spent all your mana? It could get pretty confusing. And so I think that part can be a little bit improved, but it's kind of a little bit late. So that's why I'm a little bit, it's a little bit hard. But I think in general, the fact that some mana tap for mana, other mana are just there to meet a minimum requirement, and it's not actually spent, is confusing. I think especially for players who are maybe more used to Magic, where, for example, 2 and a red is meaning like you pay 2 mana of any color, and then 1 mana of red, right? So it's 3 mana total, etc. But one of them has to be red, and it could be more than one, but at least one is red. Yeah. So in general, like that part is a little bit confusing. Yeah, and then I think like in general, right, resource tracking is pretty rough, and so that part is going to be, I think, just going to be a little tough. Anyways, I think we already talked about that part. I'm not really going to dive into it more. I guess about the resource tracking, it could lead to cheating too, right? So I can imagine turns where I may cast a spell for like 1 mana, and then I do some other stuff, and then towards the end I'll say, oh, I'm going to cast a spell for, let's say, 3 mana, but we all kind of forgot due to game state that I already spent 1 mana, so I only have 2 mana left over. Again, there's no tapping, so there's no visual indicator that I've done this. Your best way to track it is maybe with a dice on the side or something, but it's kind of a little bit, I think it's prone to a lot of cheating, which could be problematic. And even if it's not for cheating, for the opponent to track the way that you're spending your mana is pretty rough. Where, Magic, other games, is pretty good because whatever you're going to cast, you're going to put those cards, for example, Grand Archive, you put them down as reserve costs. So the cards are laid face down, so we can kind of backtrack how many you have left. Or Magic, you actually tap, you physically turn the lands so you're spending them, right? So people can look at your board state anytime and realize, oh, he has 2 unspent mana, he has no unspent mana, etc. You can kind of have a general understanding there. Casting spells. I think casting spells has been made a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. Now, I fully understand the reason why Sorcery does this is because they want to have this kind of like a D&D, your character kind of going through zones, going through a dungeon type of feel, right? You build sites, which are land, and you could walk across sites with your avatar. But the limitation is that the spell casting must be done by avatar or by something that has spell casting, meaning you can't just like cast a spell directly. You have to cast it with either your avatar or something that can cast a spell, which is a little bit tricky because obviously what that does for the game itself is that it limits the game and adds an extra layer of complexity where opponents especially have to track where your spellcasters are, right? Rather than just knowing that you can cast a spell or you can't cast a spell. Summoning sickness exists in casting spells. Not a fan of summoning sickness in general because it is confusing and there's no indicator about, like, again, it's a tracking issue. I think flavor-wise it makes sense, but it's a tracking issue. Not a big fan, but I guess it doesn't matter. If it exists in the game, I'm not really, against it. And most cards do play directly on the grid. So if you remember the 4x5, like 20 grid system, they do play on the grid. The issue becomes when some cards like auras play in the middle of the grid. And I'm assuming the whole idea here is that they're enchanting the field so they can like enchant or enhance or whatever, affect 4 different fields. So there's, again, more things that are there present for the players to track. One thing, the reason why I always state, more things to track is as games get more and more complicated, basically the idea is that there's a lot more mental stress or strain on tracking the board state. It opens up a lot of room for mistakes and errors, which essentially makes the game a little bit more difficult to play. I think that's totally fine if you're designing for a board game where kind of like the amount of different moves that each player can make is fairly limited. Because, for example, if you play a board game, let's say you pick a faction, you don't really have a choice to go and pick a second, like, different card or something like that. Like, in general, the gameplay of each faction is about the same. Whereas in Sorcery, it definitely feels like you not only have to pick a faction essentially, right? You're limited, but also you actually have to build a deck, which could actually have high variance. So now the issue becomes there's high variance on the board state, there's high variance in your actual deck. So as an opponent, think about how much calculation, thinking you have to put in to think about what's inside their deck, what's inside their hand, what's inside, like why are they laying out the field this way? Remember, it's like a map, right? So they're building a map for a reason, likely. It's not going to be random. There's not predetermined locations for where sites would go. So that, again, adds more complication. Now, talk more about complication, right? Deck building. So deck building isn't like traditional card games where you're just limited to a certain amount of each card. In fact, Sorcery, again, trying to be flavorful, I think, is asking players to play a deck that can have 4 ordinary, 3 exceptional, 2 elite, or 1 unique, right? Meaning, if you want to play a unique creature into your deck, you can only have 1 copy of it. It's a singleton. And of course, that extends all the way down from unique to elite. So the rares, you can have 2 copies, and exceptional, 3 copies, and 4 copies for ordinary. I think this, again, overcomplicates the game, right? Even for deck building, it's already a lot to think about what cards to include and how many copies. But to then add an extra limiter on, say, like, oh, for uniques, you can only have 1. I kind of get it for the uniques. I think that's actually kind of nice. It's a flavor win. But then to extend that out from unique all the way to ordinary with that many tiers, it just feels unnecessary. But again, I didn't design or balance the game, so I'm sure there's a reason for doing that, but to me, that is overcomplicating the game, right? And again, think like an opponent, right? If your opponent plays a certain card, you have to now notice that it's an exceptional card, so you know he has only 3 copies of that card, not 4. It's a little bit, or he could potentially have only maximum of 3 copy, right? So let's talk a little bit more about playing the game, right? So playing the game, I think the fact that you have to move your characters across the grid is nice. It adds an extra element to the game. But again, like I said before, if it's a board game, I think it's fine. If limited amount of like movements and different things you can do. The problem is this is a card game. This is a trading card game. The decks could be different, so it adds a little bit more complication, right? Units have symmetrical life. I personally really don't like this. I think it's limited design space, and I don't know why they did it this way. Obviously, it makes the game simpler. What that means, by the way, for Magic players is that all units are going to be 2/2s, 1/1s, 3/3s, 4/4, 5/5s. There's no variance of that. I think a lot of games actually can do variance because a 3/1 creature, for example, and a 1/3 creature are very different. And that's actually really unique in Magic and Grand Archive, where I think we're missing out if all creatures are completely symmetrical. I think one of the other issues I have with Sorcery, again, is just that overcomplication. Think about how many different decisions you actually have to make and options you have to think through on your turn. Where do I put a land card? Because where you put the land card could matter many, many, many turns later. This is like the chess problem, right? And imagine you're playing chess, except each piece has attack and defense that's a little bit different. So it's not just like a predetermined number, like where chess, one piece can always take another piece. They're equivalent, right? If I hit your piece, then I just take it. There's no like battle element that happens. But imagine chess where your pawn is actually weaker than the knight. So even if your pawn can take the knight, you have to consider like, does it have enough attack power, etc. Again, just overcomplicates the whole point of the game. Whereas in most other games, since all creatures can attack each other or whatever, the board state is just open. You don't have to consider things like a grid in addition to the fact that these health and life differences are present. Other issues, right? Like, what about like Airborne, right? So Airborne have this ability to be able to move basically diagonally because there's a concept of a neighbor, which is the all 8 grids versus like a cross, right? Which is the 4 grids directly touching adjacent to the unit. So normally units that aren't Airborne can only hit or move to boxes adjacent. Airborne units can go attack or move to diagonal boxes as well. And then there's defending, right? So defending attack can be done by direct defense, which is like kind of like chumping Magic, or it can be done by joint combat, which is like doubling up for blocking. I get it, but it's again kind of complicating the whole idea of just you're already defending a site. There's like a zone. Why even give another choice to say you can double up and do this? Yeah. Attacking a site also damages a player's life total, but it's not counted as direct damage. So if you want to kill a player, you can damage their life total by attacking sites. But when they're at the end of the game, where it's a state called the death store, where the opponent has 0 life, you have to deal a final hit. This is direct damage to their avatar. You can't just do it to a site anymore. Again, another unnecessary complication. It becomes where it's at the end of the game, the whole game kind of shifts over from an attacking site type of game to potentially chess, where you have to do a checkmate against their avatar, because essentially they can run across the board to a location where you don't have creatures, and if you can't get to them through a spell or a creature, guess what? You can't kill their champion or avatar, right? I do like the death store concept, though. I think it's really flavorful and it's actually kind of nice. So there's that. Yeah. One other thing I don't like about this gameplay of Sorcery is that the interactions feel so limited. Most of the moves that you can do are on your turn only. And the concept of stack, for example, which I think is one of the most interesting and important facts of Magic, just doesn't exist in Sorcery. Meaning there's no you use a fireball against my creature, but before the fireball lands, I'm going to buff the creature up so you can't kill the creature. Oh, before you buff it up, I'm going to lightning strike the creature. None of this concept of stacking works in Sorcery, which I do feel like is a huge miss. Basically on your turn, if it's an opponent's turn, you're not really interacting. You're kind of just watching what your opponent does to you, because there's nothing much you can do, right? Other than deciding things like blocking, those kind of things. A little bit tricky. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about mechanics, right? First of all, cards that overlap each other is really hard, because you have to pick up cards, and you got to pick up cards without touching or damaging other people's cards. I mean, if you play Magic and you know about enchantments, equipment, etc., it's already a little bit rough to kind of pick up a stack of cards and turn it, unturn it, whatever. And then imagine doing that with other people's cards too, right? Sorcery, essentially, you have to do that all the time, because if you attack a zone, you're already on top of somebody's site card, and if they have any creatures in there, you may be attacking their creature on the same land. I don't like the fact that there's a lot of overlapping, and it's already hard to deal with anyways. And then picking up cards could be problematic if you pick up a card and damage somebody's card accidentally. It's just a lot of problems I really just don't want to deal with, especially if cards can be fairly expensive. What if I pick up a card and accidentally nail scratch your card? Is that, because I'm trying to pick up my card, right? It's a little bit tricky. I don't like the fact that cards have to stack each other for this game. Keywords, oh my God. This game has 1,000 keywords out of the box with no explanations of what they are, right? So I'm looking at watching the gameplay, and I'm not a new player for a TCG. But imagine if you're a new player and somebody drops a creature down and it says, this creature is airborne and has death right, deal 3 damage. You're like, what is this, right? Or other things like stealth versus burrow. What is the difference between stealth and burrow, right? Or lethal, charge, airborne, ranged, death right, we already talked about, nearby, projectile, range, right? It's really tricky. It's really, really tricky. And I think not having a description text on the card, I know you're trying to make the card look really nice, right? But not having enough text on the card to explain what these abilities, right, keyword, evergreen keyword type of things are going to be, that's really rough for new players. And I can imagine somebody sitting down playing Sorcery for the first time, not understanding anything that's happening, and can't really remember it because there's no reminder text. And imagine you have the card in your hand, right? And you don't know what it does. What do? Do you show your opponent and ask them? Right? It's a little bit tricky, right? So you're kind of you're stuck playing some things that may just be wrong. And yes, you're forced to go learn it, but it just doesn't feel like a very fair or fun first experience for a new player. So why suffer through this? One thing I noticed, for example, the Fire Avatar had an ability where for once per turn, whatever, you can tap it and you can play a site card from your hand as a fireball. Right? Sounds pretty cool. Again, flavorfully, it's great. But do you know what a fireball does? Do you know what a casting cost of fireball is? Do you know how much damage it does or how much splash damage it does? That's the issue. Like, if you obviously have a fireball in your hand, you could look at the fireball and say, oh, I can turn this card into this card. Great, you know what it does. You essentially have to set a fireball on the side, right? Because you probably have to reference what the fireball does, but you may have to give that card to your opponent so they know what you can do. It's a little bit tricky, and again, unnecessarily complicated to do something like, hey, basically like a fetch card, right? Hey, this card can turn any card into this other card, so you have to show this card to other people. Again, all the keywords, all these like little hidden things are just not very new player friendly. So if Sorcery wants to grow as a game, all these things are going to be stumbling blocks for the game. All right, so my overall kind of thinking about Sorcery, right, given all the things I've said, I think the gameplay seems more complicated than necessary in a lot of different places, but like also surprisingly simple in other aspects, right? So symmetrical life is very simple. Not having a stack interaction is very simple, but I feel like it's like it was almost made simple. Again, this is my feeling, right? It was made simple because parts of the game is already too complicated, not because it's actually better designed for the game, right? I personally think not having symmetrical life is a great design element. I personally also think having stack, having interactions where on my opponent's turn I can do things is a great design element. I don't think simplifying those two pieces just for the sake of simplicity is actually a good thing for card games. I think there's a lot of elements of Sorcery that doesn't need to be so complicated, and maybe the balance should have been the other way. Keep the things that are fun, that are complicated, but drop the things that are just complicated for complicated sake. Maybe complicated for the sake of, I don't know, flavor or lore, right? I think if Sorcery was a board game, I would think it feels a lot better. It's self-contained, it's limited, but the problem is it's a TCG, which means people are going to be building decks. People are going to bring a lot of variance into the game, in addition to the fact that the game is already highly variable because, again, you have a map. You essentially, every game, build a new map, and that map is as much as part of the game. So it's not just playing a creature. It's playing a creature and where do you play it? And these things that you do affect for the rest of the game. Here, I'll give you an example, right? Let's imagine this grid, which is 4x5, right? So essentially, you can have a creature that you played on the far right side. And then because at some point later, you have to move this creature to the far left side. That's a 6-turn move, or 5-turn move, 4-turn move, right? You have to go 1, 2, 3, 4 to get to the far left side. That's really bad because if you think about it, like it's a feel bad for a player to have to think way ahead and say, okay, I got to play this creature maybe in the middle so I can go both ways or whatever. Again, unnecessarily overcomplicating the game for the fact that you can have this element that feels like you're moving through a dungeon or moving through land or something, right? And then there's like the resource system. We talked about this, but I think it's like really confusing for a player where this mana you have to spend and you have limited amount. This type of mana is just to meet a checkbox. Once you check the box, you're good to go. You can cast that spell. It just feels a little bit overcomplicated for, like, I'm not sure if, for the right reasons, right? The sites are interesting. I like the fact that the sites all have special abilities. They remind me of land cards, the special land cards in Magic, where like you play this land, you can shock yourself for 2, but it gives you some benefits, or you play this land, it deals damage, etc. I think that is really nice and nifty. So that's actually kind of cool. The grid system. I think the grid system is very new and very unique. I like the fact that this game challenges the standard, like norm of like not having anything like a grid system. I just, again, hoped that this game with a grid system would have made that the one complicated thing, right? If you look at how Magic has been designing things for the last 30 years, you'll notice every set, they'll introduce a new mechanic or 2, or at most 3 for standard sets, but they won't do more than that. And the reason for that is because you want to have a little bit of variance, you want to introduce something new, but you also want to give space for players to understand what these new mechanics are, understand what these new cards do. And again, adding grid system, adding the new resource system, adding like all these other things, it just, again, complicates or overcomplicates the game, right? I think one of the biggest challenges is, with Sorcery is really just the lack of that interplay, right? Lack of the fact that, like, again, it makes it simple, but on your turn, you can do things, and effectively, you know the opponent can't really do anything to you about that. So if there's a turn where you feel like you can win, you're just going to go win. To me, that just feels like a really good lost opportunity that Sorcery could have improved on. So overall, right, like I think part of the question that my patron asked me is also like, would I invest in Sorcery? Honestly, given what I've seen, given what I've like realized, my gut feeling is that Sorcery may be a very good looking game, may have all the grit and like, you know, the artwork and those kind of things going for it. And again, may have a cult following because, you know, again, there's elements of it that reminds you of old school Magic, but it doesn't have the baggage of WotC. However, given the fact that gameplay is complicated, and my theory nowadays, which is a card game cannot live by collectability alone, I think Sorcery has big problems with gameplay that's already like showing through the cracks. And my fear is long term, the gameplay is what's actually going to kill Sorcery, because part of it is like, I don't know how many players really want to put themselves through this mental pressure of playing this game. And I don't know how many new players are willing to then go pick up this game because, you know, how complicated it can be. That's my kind of gut feeling. Again, I could be wrong, but that's what it is. So personally, I'm just kind of going to step back and not really invest any money into Sorcery. I may pick up a couple things here and there, but I just don't feel like myself, like I don't really see myself playing this game because I just don't, it doesn't attract me the same way that some other card games that are more interactive attracts me. And maybe for me, that those are the kind of things I want, right? And it's just, I feel like there were some design decisions that were made. Again, I'm not a developer, I'm not a professional game designer, so obviously I can't judge how other people do this, or I can't say I can do it better, but I can still judge a finished product as a player. And for me as a player, I don't really want to play a game where I feel like other people can just take a turn and I don't do anything. I think the interaction and interplay between two players is very important for a game, and that's what I'm looking for. So there's that. If you like Sorcery, if you like the gameplay, if you like the artwork, hey man, there's nothing wrong with collecting cards. You know, you got to do what you like doing. But for me, it's just not for me. So that's a long ass video, but there it is. I hope that's helpful for answering your question about Sorcery. Mark, Solo Games, I'm out. Stay classy.